Welcome everyone to today's author showcase of the Write-Tukubuli Virtual Literary Festival of 2025. My name is Anthony Drigo, and I am proud and honored to be the host of this showcase because my guests are a very exciting guest, and we have a really intriguing topic, the Maroons of Dominica, which is a book that was written by Dr. Thomson Fontaine. Dr. Fontaine holds a PhD in financial and economics e- and international economics from Clemson University. And he is a very experienced and world renowned economist. He has worked with the IMF as the economist, and he is just getting out of a stint from South Sudan, playing a very pivotal and crucial and critical role in the making of peace between Sudan and South Sudan. But as I said, the reason why he is my guest tonight is because he is the author of the book The Maroons of Dominica, and he is a unique storyteller. The book, The Maroons of Dominica, does a brilliant job of tying together uh, history, uh, resistance, um, how would you say it? Overcoming in insurmountable or seemingly insurmountable odds by a people who were enslaved and destitute. His story speaks about the Maroons of Dominica. Most of you are familiar with Maroons associated with Jamaica, but the Dominica also has a very deep and very rich history of Maroons, and so it is indeed a pleasure to invite Dr. Thomson Fontaine to the stage so we can do the offer showcase of his book, The Maroons of Dominica, from 1764 to 1818. Dr. Fontaine, welcome to the stage. Welcome to this interview on Offer Showcase.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. It's great to be with you, and certainly thanks for the introduction and the opportunity as well to talk about a truly exciting piece of work, the Maroons of Dominica, something that I believe all of Dominica should be aware of and should know. And so I'm very excited as part of the right Tikubuli literary festival. It is great that to be able to be a part of this and to share as much as possible on this fascinating period of Dominican history.
Yes, the Maroons of Dominica. Uh, it is so wonderful that this book is being featured on this virtual literary festival. For those of you who may not be familiar with the name Right Tukubuli, it's a play on the word. The Kalinago name for Dominica was is White Tukubuli, which translates into tall is her body, because Dominica is so mountainous and with lots of peaks and superimposing mountains, and so the the white was replaced with right, and Tukubuli was kept. So I think it's a fascinating and very creative and imaginative name for the festival, which connects it directly to Dominica, and and because because the name is referring to her mountains, it is very very relevant to today's conversation that I'm having with Dr. Fontaine, because he's writing about people who escaped from slavery into the mountains of Dominica. So there's a direct tie-in to that name. Dr. Fontaine, I am going to give you an opportunity to further introduce yourself to the audience, and then we will start in earnest our conversation about your writing and the book. But let's introduce you properly to the audience.
All right, Tony. I thought you had done that already.
I did, but
You could have
I
said
did, but
most of it.
a man, a person
Yes,
with your accomplishment and stature cannot be
yes,
introduced in two
yes.
sentences. By no
Well,
means.
and then also now I'm the political leader of the
Exactly.
United Workers Party, Team Dominica. I've been for the past 3 years. As you rightly indicated, I'm just finished a stint there in South Sudan. 7 years, by the way, in South Sudan, working in the interest of peace there in this country, and otherwise an international consultant, economic consultant. I've been doing some consultancies, most recently, just as recently as last week, in Bangladesh. So I continue to straddle the professional world, in the political world, in the literary world, and have a keen interest in writing. I've done my first book. I am now in the process of writing my second, which is a little bit different. This one is actually supposed to be a statistics textbook that is targeted at first year college students. I'm trying to kind of produce a kind of very user friendly type of statistics book. So someone who is not too familiar with statistics and having to do it as a course, will be able to get a book that they can go to that explains in some detail, has many, many worked examples and so on, make it easier, drawing on my experience as a former lecturer in that area. And so I think it would be a useful addition. It's different from my first work, but it's something that I'm equally as excited about.
Yeah, because it's different from your first work, but that's because you wear several hats. Uh, as an economist, it's almost natural that statistics will be an area that you have expertise in, and I think it is a very critical. I'm excited to learn more about your project once you're ready to share it, because that is one uh, of the things the Caribbean is lacking, is the availability of good data in a timely manner that our leaders can use for decision making. And so me hearing you say that you you are in the process of developing a textbook on statistics, I think it's something that is timely and needed in the region. But we will talk about that. Also, you said that you are the political leader of the the main opposition party in Dominica, which means that you are the aspiring prime minister, the aspiring leader of the country, and so that also ties in both your experience as an economist, and I believe that if we have leaders who are as intimately familiar with our history as you are, my hope is that it would definitely inform the way you approach leadership. I think someone who understands the history of our people would lead with a lot more compassion than we're seeing right now, but also with a little more urgency about making the life of our people easier, because we know, it's as if you have a child that you adopted and you know that child was, has been through a traumatic experience. You want to accelerate how soon you can get that child to be enjoying a better life, which is what I think we need in the Caribbean. But let's talk about your book, the Maroons of Dominica. And when you read the back cover of the book, uh, Dr. Fontaine, when I read the back of the book, it says the Maroons of Dominica are very different from the Maroons of Jamaica. And so that is where I would like to start it, because uh, even when we did history in grammar school, when I did history as a high school student, there certainly there was a section or a chapter on the Maroons of Jamaica. I don't remember ever recalling in all of my history lessons in high school a session on the Maroons of Dominica, which is ironic because I grew up in Dominica. So I want to take this opportunity then for all the people like me who did the history and maybe familiar with Maroons and Jamaica to introduce them to the Dominican Maroon and highlight what is different from the Jamaican Maroons and what role they played.
Yes, indeed. It's only it is truly, truly remarkable when you think about it. When people think of Maroons, they think of the Jamaican Maroons, but interestingly enough, it was the Dominican Maroons that had the tremendous impact on the end of slavery. By 1763, when the story of the Dominican Maroons begins, the story of the Maroons of Jamaica had already largely ended. They are surrendered through treaty to the colonials, because bear in mind, slavery started in Dominica as much as 100 years after it was introduced in Jamaica and Barbados and the other countries, because Dominica was a neutral colony for all of those years. It was only in 1763 that slaves started to come into Dominica in any great measure. By that time, slavery was already well established for over 100 years, as I said, in Jamaica and Trinidad. So the Maroons had already lived out their time, so to speak. And it was the Maroons of Dominica in the 1760s, going into the early 1800s. It was their action that caught the attention of William Wilberforce, the main abolitionist, and others like him. And the fight in the British Parliament to rid the Caribbean of slavery was born out not of the work of the Maroons of Jamaica, but the Maroons of Dominica. And it is clear, even the book, for example, has a quote from one of the parliamentarians, Samuel Rutilli, who made it very clear that the Maroons of Dominica are nothing like the Maroons of Jamaica. In fact, I think it is worth reading this particular line to kind of give some guidance as to what I'm
Uh-huh.
talking about, because here's what he had to say, right? And
Hmm.
in fact, that was, yeah. So Samuel Romilly in the British House of Commons, it says Negro slavery as it exists in the West Indies is more cruel, more degrading, more alien from humanity than any such event which ever before disgraced the history of mankind. That was at the heart of the discussion of slavery. And he made that comment because he was commenting specifically on reports that had come out of Dominica about the treatment of the slaves on that country, and the work of the Maroons on Dominica. But listen to Robert Heron, who says that the Jamaican Maroons are a body of men originally composed of the Coromantin Negroes. The Dominican Negroes, on the contrary, more numerous and far more savage, consisted entirely of runaway slaves, never acknowledged by any treaty or truce whatever. They cultivated some provision grounds, but their chief dependence was on plunder, robbery, their subsistence, their occupation, murder. So what he was basically saying is that the Maroons of Dominica were by far more in number than the Maroons in Jamaica. The Maroons in Jamaica surrendered very early to the colonialists. They signed treaties of peace. The Dominican Maroons, they never surrendered. They literally had to be exterminated by a very cruel governor, Governor Ensley, who came to Dominica in April of 1813, and immediately set out to kill every single man, woman, and man that was a runaway. So he had his people chase them, and he said, "Whoever you catch, when you catch the men, you catch the women, you catch. Don't bring back any prisoners. Kill them all." And it was that barbarism, it was that savagery that really caught the attention of the British, and in particular, an individual like Wilberforce, who at the time was working for the past 6 years, because I know wrong, just before the end of the slave trade in 1807. And it was he who took all of that information and brought it to the British Parliament and says, here is what is going on. We have individuals killing women and children, all to get rid of the Maroons of Dominica. And that is where a lot of outrage was built up. And eventually, the slavery was abolished. I may not talk about Wilberforce again, but let me just make a very important point, which is in the book as well. Wilberforce, who started his campaign as a 32-year-old, he basically died the day after slavery was abolished in Britain. So he lived just long enough to see slavery ended. But a lot of his involvement, a lot of what he brought to Parliament, which is quoted in the book itself, the excess of what transpired in Dominica, and a lot of that was brought to light by the Maroons of Dominica, our famous Negmawa. And that to me is something that the Dominican public is probably not aware of if they have not read the book, or they were not aware of the significant role that our Negma of Dominica played in the abolition of slavery. We can take credit that our ancestors were the ones who brought to the fore the cruel treatment of slaves in the British West Indies, and who helped to hasten the end of slavery.
Right. And so that distinction, I think, is important to make, because there are a few points that you made that I would like to reiterate. One was that the Maroons of Dominica never signed a treaty, maybe because they were runaway slaves, so they had experienced slavery. And then when they ran away, they had a little taste of freedom and knew that they could never go back to slavery. And so they never signed the treaty, and they they actually were in a position where they had the colonials on the back foot. If you read the book by Dr. Thomson Fontaine, The Maroons of Dominica, you will understand how much of a force they were, with limited resources and always being on guard. So Thompson, what are the factors that created that sort of condition where we had a group of people that ran away from slavery and were able to stand up and resist the getting overrun and overwhelmed for decades? Uh, what about Dominica? What about, I don't know? Sometimes when you read stories, about a particular rebellion, you find out that it was a leader that came from some location in Africa who had maybe was trained. Or, I don't. Um, were you able to come up with a three or four or five conditions that came together that made that possible in Dominica? I don't think it was possible anywhere else. I don't think it happened anywhere else during that period of slavery.
You know, Tony, we've just started talking, and I'm trying not to be emotional, yeah. But I'll tell you, the story of these guys is so fascinating, because one of the major highlights of the Maroons is the fact that they a lot of the leaders were actually princes. So, for example, my book starts with the story of the Princes of Caliber. These were two princes of royalty from Africa who were brought to Dominica uh, at the very beginning, like 1763, when it's the very first year, and they managed to escape to England. All right, they did not stay in Dominica. They ended up in England,
Wow.
and then they were able to buy their freedom. They were able to buy their freedom in England and return to Africa. That is
Oh
this.
wow.
That's the setting on which our story is built, because you find following them now a number of others. So, for example, one of the most noted Maroons of Dominica that every Dominican know the name on is Jacko. We have a place named after him, the Jacko Flats in Bells. Jacko was a prince from Guinea. Okay, he was a royalty from Guinea. Jacko lived 46 years in Dominica and did not spend one single day as a slave. He did not spend one day as a slave, because on the same day that he arrived, he was able to escape into the hills of Dominica. And the reason why he was able to do that is because already there was a community of slaves that were helping slaves as they were coming up the ship, helping them to escape. and to run away. And then he was able to dodge capture, even after all of his other mates like Bala and Mabuya and Fast, even Facel, all of these guys were killed or captured. He was able to evade capture. And it's because you had a group of men who I believe who had a certain level of intelligence, because coming as a prince of Africa, you would obviously have grown up in royalty, and you'd have had some different opportunities that other the average person did not have. So guys like Bala before Jacko, and in fact they worked together. Balo and Jacko, they spent some time, quite a number of years together, building the rebellion in Dominica. They appeared to be guys who were highly educated, and they used their influence to be able to draw people and then to plan strategy. These guys were strategizing on how to kill the white man, how to invade the plantations, how to get rid of the cows and then to feed themselves, and so to go raid the plantation so they can have salt and so on to be able to cook and to thing. And they were raising families. They were raising families who had never seen. In fact, in the book we give the story of when the camp of Bala, which was just over Rosalie in the Grand Fort area there, when they discovered the Bala camp, they met a number of children, and they were seeing the white man for the very first time. These were children who were born as the children of the Negmawo, and they were living in the bushes of Dominica and had never set eyes on a white person. The first time they saw them was when they overran the Bala camp. And that is the reason why the world was, they were so shocked and outraged when Governor Ensley in 1813 said that they need to kill the children as well, not just the slaves when they hold the runaways, but they need to execute the women and children. He put that by way of proclamation, So I'm saying this to say that I believe that what we see, or what I'm gleaning from where those individuals came and where they were captured. These were highly skilled individuals, highly intelligent individuals who were able to strategize and, quite frankly, outwit, using the natural advantages of Dominica, which, by the way, they were showed and accommodated by the Kalinago Indians. It was the Kalinago Indians who had never been enslaved themselves, but whom the white men met on Dominica, who knew every nook and cranny of the island, who actually helped our black brothers in the very early years to know where the hideouts were, to know the places. In fact, there is a quote in the book that talks about one of the governors saying it has about over 100 places that they just could not access, but where the runaways were located and where only they knew, because of the familiarity with Dominica and the Kalinagos. So the advantage they had was that they were able to use it, although they were coming to a country that they were new and fresh of, but they were also coming to a country that the Kalinagos were already well established. They were not enslaved, and they were able to give them that assistance to escape.
So that I'm so happy I asked that question, because there are a number of factors that you said came together. The fact that Dominica is one of the islands that up to this day still have Kalinagos living there. So the slaves in the other islands would not have had that opportunity to have local intelligence that they could use.
And
That's
also, I mean, imagine a slave in Antigua. Where are you going to hide? There are no mountains. They would find them the following day. The countries are small. Barbados is extremely flat. The difference is that Dominica as well was also extremely mountainous, with all the valleys and the mountains. And that is why, and that's the reason why you found Maroons only in Dominica and Jamaica. Jamaica also had the Blue Mountains, where even today you have communities there, where they actually left and they were able to hide out. But Dominica was the country that provided the most unique circumstance to allow the slaves to stay free and to stay, basically unhindered, until, of course, the governors began, because they would come and raid the estates. And every time they raided the estates, they would take some of the slaves back. For example, when they raided the Rosalie estate in December of 1783, 20 years after slavery was introduced in Dominica, 180 slaves in Dominica, only about 3 slaves stayed behind. They liberated the entire slave population and took them back with them to the camps. So that was the kind of activities that was going on in Dominica with the Maroons, and that is why, Anthony, the other thing is, you may ask me that question later, but that I since I'm thinking about it now, you know one of the motivations for me in writing this story, and as I'm talking about it now, is the Rosalie estate. Because as you know, I'm from the village of Grand Fort. Our
Hmm.
parents and our great grandparents are children of slaves who worked on the Rosalie estate. And I grew up all of those years. I mean, I was a history school teacher in the academy, a high school history school teacher. I taught history. I always loved the history. I know Russian history, American history, Cuban history, but I didn't know the Dominican history. I had never heard of Bala raiding the Rosalie estate. I'd heard of Bala back here because we know about everybody talks about the some of the most well-known Negmao. You know of Bala and Jacko and so on. But what I never knew until I was listening to a lecture by Edward Scobie a few years ago, when he mentioned Bala was living in Grand Fort and raided the Rosalie estate and destroyed the Rosalie estate. I was like, what? I never knew that. I never heard about it up to that point in my adult life. And that is what triggered my search, to say, no, that story must be told. We cannot have that kind of history. It is hidden, it is not known to the world, and it has to be told. And Makio, that is critical history, because later on, as we go through, as I discuss the method that I used to research that book, going online and finding over 250 accounts of the raid on the Bala estate, of Bala's raid on the Rosalie estate in the newspapers of the day. That is equivalent to the September 9/11 attacks, where every newspaper was reporting on it. Practically every newspaper in existence, not only in the United Kingdom, but in Scotland, in Ireland, in the United States, where the colonists were fighting against the British, they were reporting on the Maroons of Dominica. They were reporting those stories. They were reporting on Bala. They were reporting on what happened in 1783, and so it was huge news at the time, and that is part of our history, and very few of our Dominican people are even aware of it.
So, I this conversation is it's a conversation that we need to have, but it's a conversation that leaves me um not well angry and frustrated, because here we are, just not being able to record our history, and we still don't record our history. So Dr. Fontaine, when you say that, when in starting to research your book, you found newspaper clippings about this incident that happened, and it was published all over the world, but yet you and I, we we went through all the education system in Dominica. We went through A-level college, and we went to university. And in university, I fraternized with a lot of people from Jamaica and the other islands. As a matter of fact, one of the most surprising things that happened to me when I came to the US was that I met Jamaicans who had never heard of Dominica. And those are Jamaicans that went through the entire education system of Jamaica and were in the US, some of them in their PhD programs and so on, and they had never heard of the island of Dominica, because we just refuse to give any significance, any type of gravitas, any type of weight, any types of relevance to our stories. And I don't want to take us too much off topic, but I'm saying even after well, I was in grammar school when CXC started in 83, 82, 83. So that gives us what, 50 years, 20, yeah, 40 years, let us say.
40, yeah.
of 40 years of we supposedly being in control of our curriculum. And those things still haven't been added to the curriculum of the Caribbean islands. Stories of so I, I don't want to take us off the book too much, but that is something that because you've done the research, because you've worked in developing like the start of a new country, South Sudan, because you've had all of this experience. Why do you have you come up with any type of explanation? Because for us to solve it, we have to know why that is.
I told you I was a high school math teacher. I a math teacher, but also history teacher. I was teaching history as well. Same time I was doing math at the academy, and I was teaching Russian history. I was teaching our Dominican kids about Rasputin and the Tsar and Nicholas II and so on, the Tsar Russian Empire. And so a country far away had nothing to do with Dominica. And there it was, the history of Dominica was not being taught. I remember, in fact, when I saw the curriculum, I was quite disappointed. And I found a way towards the end of the each year. I would introduce the Black Jacobins, a book by C.L.R. James that talks about the history of slavery, and I was able to at least introduce some of that to our students. But it was not part of the curriculum. The part of the curriculum was European history. That will be that, because that was what the exams were on for the CXC. So you prepare the kids from even from fourth form to get prepared to do exams in history, right? So I think it's just a mismatch of a whole. And but unfortunately, all of these years later, it has not been fixed. And part of the problem is that we simply has not done enough. We have not written the history of Dominica enough. I mean, I'm very happy that we have had the work. We've benefited from the work of Lennox Honeychurch. He's done quite a bit. In fact, I learned quite a lot from his book on the fighting Maroons of Dominica. He has a very interesting piece. I quoted some of his work in my book as well. But I approached this work with a great interest in history, but also got very fortunate in the sense that I'm not a historian. All I had and the only knowledge I had was a knowledge of research. I knew how to research. So I can research a document. I know how to fact check. I know how to double check. So I thought, although I'm not a historian, but I can bring that ability to do research to that project, which is what took me to the internet and to those archives of newspapers that was chronicling the activities of the Maroons of Dominica over many, many years. They were all there in the archives, right? But nobody had quoted them. Nobody had mentioned them because traditionally, even with the work of Lennox Honeychurch and others, they were relying very heavily on the records of the the national, how do you call it? Not the heritage, the national archives in the
Okay.
United Kingdom that relies heavily on the records of the view of the governors. A lot of the material around slavery and so on and the Negmawa was coming from the pen of the governors and the colonial office and individuals who were writing about that period. But then I come across a source of kind of an independent source of newspapers, especially newspapers from the United States that were putting, if you like, putting blows on the British for the system of slavery. And they were reporting on it. So you had a lot of good information that I was able to cross check with the traditional archives. But those newspaper accounts were invaluable to the work that I was able to do. They were not always. I had to actually go to the archives and get some of those records as well. But I also got a lot of good material from hundreds of newspapers that are archived going back to that period, the 1763 to 1818 period.
So, folks, if you're just joining me, if you're just joining this conversation, I'm having a conversation with Dr. Thomson Fontaine, the author of the book The Maroons of Dominica. I'll put it up here. The Maroons of Dominica, 1764 to 1818, resistance, rebellion, and freedom from slavery. This is part of the author showcase series as part of the Write-Tukubuli virtual literary festival. Write-Tukubuli virtual literary festival. I'm saying it that way because it's intended, I know, to hopefully it becomes an annual event. We got tremendous response from the authors. It's right to Kubuli because the first focus was on Dominican writers. Dr. Thomson Fontaine is Dominican, born and raised. He's an economist with a PhD from Clemson University in financial and international economics. And he has written the book, The Maroons of Dominica, 1764 to 1818, to tell that story. Because what we are going through right now is the fact that we were not taught that history. We were not taught that history in detail from the people who were enslaved. And when we were kids, Dr. Fontaine and myself were high school kids and so on. Our education was tied to the University of Cambridge and London University in the UK. And so they set the curriculum. And so we could probably sort of understand why a lot of those stories of our people, our grassroots stories, did not make it into the curriculum. But we've just, revealed or pointed out that the Caribbean Examination Council has been in charge of our curriculum from the 80s, the early 80s. And now they're fully in charge because there was a transitionary period, but they've been fully in charge for at least 30 to 35 years. But those type of stories still haven't made it into the curriculum where every boy and girl that grows up in the region reads those stories and understands their identity and what it means to be a West Indian. Uh, what we see right now that's associated with being a West Indian is carnival. Carnival is the biggest um, heritage and culture that we see out of the West Indies. But even that, a lot of the folks who are celebrating Carnival and taking part in the Bacchanal don't even understand that a big part of the history of Carnival comes from the enslaved people taking to the streets and celebrating on the announcement of their emancipation, the abolition of slavery. And so the book that we're featuring, that I'm talking today, I have the pleasure of talking today with Dr. Fontaine. The Maroons of Dominica is extremely important. It is really at the nexus of our identity as West Indians. And if we have to find a way to get that knowledge into the heads of every single boy and girl from primary school, so that we can change the outcomes of our people in the region, we have to be able to get our folks to understand exactly what it is to be West Indian, to understand the we have to get them to understand the how we got to where we are, and therefore to be just have our young people aspiring to migrate to another country in order to make a living, how that is really an atrocious thing based on how many people died and suffered and were butchered and brutalized to get us uh, where we are. Dr. Fontaine, as we continue our conversation, as you said, you were a history teacher, you were a math teacher, but you approach this book from just doing pure research into a subject that interested you because you wanted to know, connect back to your ancestors. In your book, you say that you're writing this book about 100 years. Your grandparents were born about 100 years after the abolition of slavery. And so you wanted to make that connection. I want you to walk us through, although you touched on the edges of it, how you went about doing the research, so that if there is someone who has a similar interest, can understand that it is possible, that the information exists, and I was even surprised to hear you say that it's on the internet. So let's talk about how you went about getting all of the information that you have, and getting it into that wonderful book of record of our people.
There were basically, yes, you're right. There were basically two main sources of that research: the archives, the United Kingdom National Archives, that gave me the records of the governors of Dominica, the countless letters back and forth between Dominica and the colonial office, um, different accounts of individuals, but a large part of it came from the newspaper accounts of the day. And I was very fortunate in that I was able to access a source online that's called newspapers.com. But what they've done is that they went back and they literally scanned all of the news, the physical paper newspapers of the day. They've scanned those, made them as PDFs, and put them online, but in a searchable form. So you're able to go in there, type in Bala Dominica, and all these stories of Bala comes up on and you see it on the, as it was on the original paper. Okay,
Wow.
so they have kept the papers as they were. They have just scanned them, but they made them searchable, so you can search it. So a lot of the information, Philadelphia Inquirer, even papers that survive today, like the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Times of London, was a huge source of the most prestigious paper in the U.S. today. They were existing even then, 250 years ago, you know. And you have the Gazette, Scottish Gazette. You have all of these different papers that are there on the internet with the information. So I was extremely fortunate to be able to utilize those sources. And then, although I was not a historian, but what I think helped me a lot was I've always been interested in writing. So even when I was in at the Sixth Form College, I was the editor of our newspaper at the time at the Sixth Form College. So I've always had an interest in writing. And then a few years later, many years later, in fact, I started at Dominican.net, which I managed and wrote for over 12, 13 years. I would do constant writing and research. So I knew how to write in terms of being able to communicate to the public, but I also had the academic aspect of research, how to research material and how to make sure you quote and you don't plagiarize and all the rest of it. So I had that, and I was able to use those skills to really put this all together. And then not only that, put it together, but looking for a story within the story. So I was asking myself, what made this young man tick? Because remember, these guys came into Dominica as a young man in their early 20s, some of them even in their teenage years, right? But even then, they were thinking of freedom. Most of them chose death over life. You know, there is one very interesting case of a guy called Kwashi, one of the leaders called Kwashi. A judge put a bounty, and it shows they could read as well, because the judge put a bounty out on his head. I can't remember the amount, but then the following day, Kwashi put out a bounty on the head of the judge and his wife for double the amount. And someone was able to get that information out. So you were dealing with a group of highly intelligent individuals that knew how to strategize and were fighting tooth and nail slavery, and the injustice that was slavery. And they found a home in Dominica, and they were able to exploit. And even, and I also tell this the story as well. even the slaves, the Negma in Dominica, even when they went out, because one of the things was when they started going after them actively, because they started issuing bounties for the arrest, they started paying people, even slaves, to tell them, or to, they would pay them money to give them information as to where they were, and sometimes they would catch some of those runaways, but they would not keep them in Dominica. They would send them out to neighboring countries. And I got this very interesting newspaper account of a runaway slave who arrived in Antigua. He was arrested in Dominica, and as his punishment, he was sent to Antigua, out of Dominica, sent to Antigua. And within a couple of days of arriving in Antigua, he entered the home of a planter whilst he was sitting at breakfast with his family, and held them hostage, and was threatening to kill every single one of his wife and his 3 children, and the planter, and the white planter. And guess who delivers a death blow to this guy? The slave that was working in the house of this man, who came up behind him and struck him down. And then
Wow.
they ended up cutting both of his hands, his legs, and just brutal treatment that he got. But that was a slave, a Negma from Dominica, who had ended up in Antigua, who was not going to just sit with the rest of the Antiguan slaves and work on the plantation, but was determined to do something. So it seems they had a different mindset about how they were going to approach this whole idea of slavery. And they were actively waiting to rescue people, to get them out. And they were very lucky in the sense that, they found very early on, they found the babule, the wild yam, that we
Hmm.
still have in Dominica today, up to this day. That was a major source of their of what they think. And that's the whole idea of, that's when the dash and all the rest of it came in. And very often, when they would go after them, they would organize those search parties to go after them. They would find those gardens of yams and dashin, that they would know that they have slaves close by. But they had all kinds of ways of disguising it. They would plant their gardens way miles away, sometimes, from where they were living. So even if those soldiers came upon the garden, they would not necessarily find them, unless they happen to be working on the garden on that
At
day,
the time, right.
at the time. But they come so well hidden. So just the guile that they use, and I mean, you're talking about 1716 to 1763. That's 37 years plus another 54 years. 54 years of constantly fighting, constantly bringing attention to the plight of the slaves, of the enslaved people in the Caribbean, and they almost succeeded. In the book again, we have this very interesting uprising that was supposed to happen in conjunction with some of the resistance from Martinique, and the Maroons of Dominica as well. They were in high demand, the Negmawa, because even in Haiti, some of them left to go to Haiti, and they organized to take over the estates. They were going to liberate all of the estates. They were going to start in the estates that was owned, interestingly, by the Sorendos, the Sorendos in Delices.
And Delicious, uh-huh.
Yes, the plan was to start with that, um, estate, with the help of a guy named Pollinaire. Pollinaire was a French. He was one of those French Creoles who was a freedom fighter in his own rights, and he came to Dominica to help mobilize the Negmawa to those uprising, and they enlisted the help of a guy by the name of Facel. You may have heard about Facel.
Hmm.
Um, Ali Claza wrote a fascinating book, fictitious but based on the life of Facel, the slave, and the Negmawa. Fascinating, because he used to live. He was living in the Collio, in the Collio area. But the idea was to organize the slaves to have an uprising. They would begin in Delices, and they would come up the coast. They would wipe up all their estates. They would go across to Bedica, liberate Rosalie, and then go across there and liberate all of the slaves. And Polynear was able to come, but on the day that they were supposed to raid the estate, Fassel was a no-show. Fassel was supposed to mobilize some resources, mobilize some slaves, and they would go and free that slave. So they had their plans well laid out, and that's where the history gets very interesting, because a lot of people have Fassel as a huge hero. He was at one stage, because we have accounts of him where he was seen with Bala and with Jacko and so on. But later on, people felt that he may have sold them out, because when he was supposed to have showed up in Delices with Polynear and the other slaves to liberate that estate, he was a no-show that day. And there's a lot of conjecture as to why he did not come and why that whole plan fell through. And they were able to suppress them. And that was the end. But that was a potential time. And you're talking about, that was in the year, it was well before the abolition of slavery. That was right around 1801, right around the time there were the crumblings of the revolution in Haiti, and they were already mobilizing for revolution in Haiti. We were planning our own here in Dominica with our Neg Maron. And it did not succeed because they were able to bring it down brutally. But the story is told in the book. The whole history of that episode is also in that book, because it captures another element of the struggle to free Dominica, to free the country from slavery, involving people from Martinique and from Guadeloupe, involving them in that, But these are some of the stories that we have, and these are some of the things I think that are just so exciting, and to bring that perspective, and that is what I was able to get. Just not being a historian, but looking for the story within the story, and that's the other reason why I paid a close attention to Wilberforce, because I learned about Wilberforce in
Yes,
history,
in our history
in
classes
our
as
history, right?
well.
You learn
Yeah.
about the great liberator Wilberforce. What I did not
Emancipated.
learn was that Reverend Charles, who was a rector of the church in the Methodist Church in Roseau, he was the one who provided Wilberforce with a lot of the material that he used to argue in Parliament. He smuggled documents out of Dominica and met secretly with Wilberforce in London to give him the information and the material that he was able to use to convince and to debate, firstly for the end of the slave trade and later for the end of slavery. But I never knew about this reference until I started the research in this book. So all of that information is there, but it has not been told, and to be able to discover that, and to get the diary of the Reverend as he describes his role, and to be able to verify it with other newspaper accounts, it was just really, really, really fantastic.
So, Dr. Fontaine, the cover of the book, the photo of the cover of the book, is actually a monument that has been erected in remembrance of the great um, heroes, the warriors for freedom. Your book says resistance, rebellion, and freedom from slavery. I know you were very instrumental in getting that monument erected. Let's talk about that journey a bit.
No, I was not involved. I
Oh, you
was
were
not
not
involved in
involved.
that. No, I was not involved. In fact, that particular picture there is a picture. The guy, the one in the center, is the actual picture on the monument.
Uh-huh.
But Giftus John, a photographer, was able to take the picture and manipulate it in such a way to give us those free images, which is really, really. From the time I saw it, I was like,
Yeah,
that is
this is
what I want.
magnificent. Yeah,
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 the
yeah.
only thing I would have liked one with the women, because
That was going to be my next
our
question. So we
women
can.
were our men. I am telling you something. The story of the women leaders, they were not, again, coming from an African culture where the women are second class, or they're not as forward as the men, but the women played a significant role in support of the movement, and some of them were actually executed. There is that particular girl, I think her name was Rachel. She was found guilty of being a runaway. She was pregnant. She made the child, and the day after she made the child, she was executed. So the women, they were just as engaged, they were just as stubborn as the men in resisting slavery. And we have many stories of them, of different women in the book, especially towards the latter part of the book. You have the stories of the women. And the other thing that we have in the book, and I thought it had to be put down in detail, is the names of the people who were caught and killed. Name of the slaves, over 500 of them, over a 2-year period, and every single name is mentioned. But these are just like one names, right? It's just like, um, you would have, for example, the runaway slaves that were captured. One guy by the name of John. He's a male. He belonged to Mrs. Nibbs. He was a slave of Mrs. Nibbs. He was taken on 14th of July 1813. How he was disposed of, he was sold. We have another one, Samson, who was banished. We have Hippolyte, who was killed. We have many of them banished. A lot of them were just banished. As I said, some of them were sent out to the neighboring islands. But in there, you have a number of women. You have Bella. Then you have Kuti and Child, who were taken in that year, and how they were disposed of, executed. You have Hector, who was executed. You have many of them, when they were caught, they were sent back to their owners, and that is recorded. So you have those details there of the names of these individuals, the names of these women. You have the women, sometimes they were taken with their children. Sometimes their children were kept and they were killed. And all of that is given. And I've been able to put it there. Because I wanted us to remember the names of these people, like Angelique, like Flore, like Louisiane, Dorinda,
Mm-hmm.
Belinda,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oko. So not we know the names of the leaders, the Jackals and the Farcells and the Ballas, but these individual people who suffered for being Negmawa when they were captured, many of them lost their lives. This individual there, Martin or Martin, he died in jail on 24th September. And the list just goes on. You have Conde, you have Priscilla, who was sold back to her owner. And the other thing was, as you go through that again, is the brutality of the treatment of the Negmawa. So the story is told of this bloodthirsty Governor Ainsley, who 1 year he was the one who issued the proclamation to kill the men, women, and children. And what it did was, like before, they would try the slaves and they would probably keep them in jail, where they would banish some of them and so on. But then he built, and that's where the gallows were built in the market in Roseau.
Right.
So he built the courthouse in the marketplace. They would try them in the morning, and by 4 o'clock they would be executed. So there was no chance of them escaping. Try them in the morning, and he would make sure, he would sign to make sure that they are sure and truly dead by 4 p.m. that day.
So that old market square is sacred ground. There's a lot of warrior
Sacred
blood.
ground. A lot of blood was shed there. A lot of innocents. A lot of women were executed there. A lot of men were executed. Number of them by hanging. They had a very famous way of doing it. When they execute them, some of them they would put their pole, and that happened especially in the Hillsborough estate. They would cut their heads and they would put the heads on a pole as a warning for others, you know, and just the barbarism and the brutality that all people suffered. I mean, when you read this book, you cannot help but cry at some point, because it goes into very graphic detail of some of the pain and the suffering that the people, our forebears, went through. It's just incredible when you read those different accounts. But one of the things I'm really proud of and very happy about is that the story of the women who fought so bravely alongside the men comes out very, very powerfully in this, and in some cases we go into detail talking about them, talking about their story. And how we have that is because of the transcripts. They would keep very detailed notes of the transcripts of the trials. So during those trials of these women, those stories would be recorded, and we'd be able to extract from that to put out in the book.
So, Dr. Fontaine, that brings me to a question that I have that's been bothering me. You were able to go back hundreds of years and get clippings from newspapers that tells the story. I know right now in Dominica there's the Sun newspaper, probably the single newspaper in print. There's also Dominica News Online. There's some stuff with MO News, but I may be wrong, but I have the sense that in Dominica right now we're going through a period where a lot of things are happening in Dominica that's not being recorded. And I, I'm putting it out there. I don't know what. It's not really a question, but I would invite your comment as somebody who has benefited from people writing stuff down that is available hundreds of years later. At that period where uh, a lot of statistics are not being kept, a lot of records are not being written. We're going through maybe a period of very, very low accountability, and probably where um, there's things happening that people would rather not be recorded. It's amazing that these folks were being so brutal and still recording it, right? I think now we might be going through a period where folks they're aware of what they have to lose, and therefore they're avoiding recording a lot of what's going on. Wh- uh, uh, As I said, it's not really a question, but if you had to talk about that kind of environment, and what it augurs, we don't have a theater where it can be captured in plays. I guess where I'm heading with it is the importance of the book, not only in doing the research and putting it in one place, but the fact that that book exists. So maybe one day, maybe 10 years from now, somebody will make it a textbook that is taught in the schools. That's going to give a glimpse of what is happening. But how about not keeping records, at least in an official way? Um, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a travesty. I think it's really of crying shame because, as you said, you need to record, and that has been a timeless tradition of humanity. Humankind has been recording the dates for many. That's why we're able to look back and reflect and say, well, we'll not go down this route. We'll do differently because they behave in that fashion. And that was the outcome. It is very unfortunate that we are running away from that tradition that we had of newspapers is no longer there. Dominica had just a number of newspapers in the past: the Dominican, the Herald, of
Chronicle.
course, the Star.
Hmm.
You had a number of newspapers. In my own research, I've chronicled quite a bit of papers from Dominica that was a staple of the country at the time. We moved away from that tradition, but I think that is a loss to us. As your greatness is measured in how, and that's why I guess that's why the British excelled in it. They were at that time they were the predominant power in the world, and they recorded every single thing. They recorded everything. They arrested a man. They had to say how long he was arrested for, where he was put, what happened to him, who owned him. They kept those meticulous records. And in this day and age, we have moved away from that, and that I think is really unfortunate. It's really unfortunate, and it certainly does not help us.
All right. So the book that we're featuring, folks, is a book written by Dr. Thomson Fontaine, The Maroons of Dominica, and he is the author on Showcase right now as part of the Write-Tukubuli Literary Festival. Get your copy of the book, Dr. Fontaine. I want you to take the opportunity to tell folks where they can access the books. They can get their own copy, I think every family, every household in Dominica, in whether every Dominican household, whether in Dominica or outside of Dominica, should have a copy of this book because it's a history book, it's a story book. There are stories in there. Time limits us as to the stories that I can ask Dr. Fontaine to recount. But there are stories in there that will make you cry. There are stories in there that will make you proud. There are stories in there that will get you frustrated when we see people, because of their circumstances, succumb to bribes and other things that makes them that affected or delayed the freedom of our people. But one thing I am sure it will do is that it will make you pause and wonder. In Dominica, one of our folk songs says, "Pa quite yo point Dominic hod nous." Do not make them take Dominica from us. And when you get to read this book, you understand that in that context, Dominica is a treat, is a treasure that was handed to us by our ancestors. And maybe we will think twice about standing by and watching the gentrification that's happening in Dominica right now. Watching Dominica be governed in a way that it is to the benefit of almost everybody else but Dominicans. And so, Dr. Fontaine, Uh, one of there are a couple more questions that I wanted to ask you, but in answering it, I want you to, just talk about the whole concept of uh, this book, the inspiration. We went through that a little bit, the inspiration for it, but we can wrap it up and summarize it. Um, what it means to you. I am guessing here, but I'm sure if this book becomes the major part of your legacy, you will not be disappointed. Besides being a world renowned economist, besides going to the far reaches of the world and working and so on, um, I am pretty sure that this book that you presented in this book is part of one of the things that you're proudest of. Because when you see the book and you see the amount of reference material in the book and the amount of detail, you understand the long hours that went into creating this work. So we'll talk about that and how we can. Because I'm sure you have ideas, having been so immersed in it, how we can do better. At first, at one, recognizing the people who struggled and sacrificed, and two, what can we what can we do to make them proud that all of what they did not happen in vain.
Yes, indeed. Tony, when you read, and which is what we were exposed to some extent, was slavery in the Caribbean, and you read about the over 200 years of slavery in the British West Indies. For Dominica, it was much less than that. As I said, we only started in 1763. We were late on the scene. But when you think about it, and you realize that this book chronicles the role that it took Dominica, the last country to be colonized in that way with slavery. It took the actions of our forebears, our ancestors, to bring enough attention to the plight of the slaves in the British West Indies, that Wilberforce was armed with information from Dominica, that the newspapers of the day were reporting upon, so that the parliamentarians, when they were in the House of Lords or in the House of Commons in Parliament, they'll be reading the Times of London about a story out of Dominica. And they had this constant information that helped them as they went through the debate on the abolition of the slave trade and eventual abolition of slavery. When you consider the role that Dominica played in all of this, it gives you every sense to be proud. because you have to consider that slavery continued in the United States for further 40 years after abolition in the British West Indies. All right, so that tells you something. In other words, they were able to force that point, force that story of slavery on the conscience of the British people, so that more and more individuals, more and more parliamentarians began to take up the cause in the House of Parliament to eventually force its end. And so that gives you a tremendous sense of pride. What also gives you a tremendous sense of pride is the dignity and the way in which our people suffered, but did that with dignity. They were not afraid to die for their cause. They were not afraid to die. I mean, when you listen to the words of Jacko, for example, he called himself the tree. When he was wounded on the ground, dying, and the soldier reached out and actually pour, and he reports on taking, literally ripping his heart out. Okay, I guess you need to feel the heart of the man, of a man who'd given them all that trouble for over 40 years. And you see the dignity and the pride that they showed in the face of death, in the face of mutilations, in the face of rapes of our ladies, the ladies that were raped by the men, by the planters or their owners or their appointees, whoever they left in charge of their estates, and what they had to endure, and how they went through it stoically and bravely, and having to work those long hours in the fields, and doing it with a sense of pride, and knowing that, probably dreaming that one day they would be free. Many of them not seeing it because they died before slavery could have been abolished. But it gives you a tremendous sense of pride to be part of that history, to understand that in your veins flows the blood of these individuals who stood up against the biggest abomination in the history of humankind, where one race was subject to another race to work day in, day out, so that that one race could become rich at the expense of the other. It was done simply for economic benefit. It makes you feel proud to be a part of that. And that's what I like about this book, The Maroons of Dominica, because now we have something that tells us about our ancestors. And the stories will just lie in there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be read, waiting to be revealed. And now it is there. It is in a book. It is featured in the book. It tells us, it names the individuals. It tells us of the Rachels, the Moniques, and the others who were just brutally executed because they ran away. And so it makes you feel really good, at least personally to me. It was extremely emotional. Even today, when I think of some of the stories, when I reread some of it sometimes, it brings a lot of emotion. I can tell you, a lot of emotion, because you understand the viciousness of the system of slavery, of this plantation system, and how our people were subjected for so long. But also it's a sense of hope, because it tells you the indomitable spirit of our Black ancestors, and how they were determined to overcome. They were determined to overcome. And in a lot of cases, they were prepared to do it with their lives. And that, to me, is a tremendous story. It's something that should encourage us, even in our own struggles today. That should be a source of encouragement. We should ask the question, what would our ancestors do? Would they just back down? No. They stood up and fought. They escaped when they could. They killed when they had to, so that they themselves could be free. So they did what they had to do, and it's a tremendous story. I wish more people would get a hold of it and read it, more Dominicans, because if you're equipped, and when you're equipped with that sense of history, it changes your outlook in so many different ways. It changes the way you look at life. It changes the way you think of things, because when you look at the heroics of these individuals, and what they've done, and then just this, and at the same time the mindset of the masters, how they went after them. It's a tremendous story, and it's something that all Dominicans get a hold of. It's relatively inexpensive. It's just 30 EC dollars available at, no, sorry, 35 EC dollars available at Jay's bookstore. So for those of you in Dominica, you can get it at Jay's bookstore. The other good thing is it is available at every major bookstore across the globe. So you can find the Maroons of Dominica in practically every major European country, in Japan, in the United Kingdom, everywhere. It's on Amazon, Books a Million, Barnes and Noble. All of these top booksellers have this book. It's also available in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So it is available. But if you want a copy, it's just 30 EC dollars, and online it is $29. So it is readily available, and people should make avail themselves of a copy, because this is our history. It's a proud one. It's a good one.
Yes, I agree. I agree, Dr. Fontaine, that this book should be read by every Dominican, by every West Indian. I know it says the Maroons of Dominica, but it should be read by every West Indian, because a lot of times the history tries to tell us that our people just accepted slavery and had to depend on somebody from the outside to come and have pity on them and to plead and so on their behalf. This book totally throws that
Mm,
concept, that suggestion, out the window and into the trash bin where it belongs. It highlights the constant resistance to slavery. And in Dominica, we had the mountains and the rugged terrain that
mhm,
provided the protection. So we had the Maroons. But in the other islands where they didn't have the mountains, they had their own forms of resistance. They
mhm.
had their own forms of keeping themselves going. Something before we close off, there's something that is curious. Because I heard you talk about, a Creole that came from Martinique. We had folks that came from different regions in Africa, and we know their languages were diverse. Plus, you spoke about them being able to read um, postings and whatever was circulated. So they had to, not only did they learn English, they also learned to communicate with each other. Did you find anything that sort of laid a trail as to, and we know we have Creole, and I don't, people a lot of times say that Creole is just a broken form of French, but to me it doesn't seem like that's a full story of Creole. But what did you find out? Did you have about the ability of these folks from different backgrounds, different regions, to communicate with each other, even if they had different languages?
Well, one of the things you would notice that the slaves, they would come from a particular region, so they had that commonality of language, but
Oh,
on the plantation they were not allowed to speak the language, and French was the dominant one, because one of the things that happened, even when the French captured Dominica in 1763, the British started bringing slaves into Dominica. The French captured Dominica in 1778. So a number of the plantations went on the slave control in 1778. So a number of the slaves coming into Dominica, they were forced to speak that's where they had to learn. I guess they had to learn the language, some English, others French. So that, now, even after the French, although the French lasted only, in that case, they conquered Dominica in 1778, took over, but 6 years later, or really 5 years later, in 1783, sorry, the British retook Dominica. But interestingly enough, when the British retook Dominica, they allowed some of the plantations, they allowed some of the French owners to maintain those plantations, to the point where later on they were accusing the French of colluding with the slaves to try to keep them out of Dominica. It's a very interesting dynamic there. But in terms of the language, and there is some debate, as you said, about the Creole language. My understanding is that the Creole that was being spoken in Dominica and in Haiti and so on, that is actually French. That, and that's the reason why you find the similarities in the Creole spoken in Haiti and in Dominica, because remember, the slaves in Haiti had French masters. The slaves in Dominica for many, many years had French masters, even when it was under British rule. You had plantations that were run by French slave masters.
Mm.
Okay, so that's the commonality of the language, and the reason for that is that this is not necessarily broken French, but that French, that was French spoken in a particular region of France. Because if you know the history of France, they eventually were able to unite the languages into like one. But at all, in the 1700s, you had different dialects being spoken. And the belief is that the Creole dialect that the French slaves and so on learned on the plantation came from individuals who came from that specific region. So that is one. I've not researched it fully enough, but that is one thing that has been put forward as to why it is. Because if you listen to the words, even when I learned French in school and I started studying French, the words were the same. A lot.
Hmm.
The only thing that was different was the grammar. But a lot of the words are the exact same thing in Creole as they are in French. So it's not like you mispronouncing a French word. You are just not speaking it correct grammatically, but the words are still there. You're not conjugating as you speak. So that is one of the things that I think happened, and it's something that certainly would necessitate more research. But they were able to communicate with each other. Obviously, the slaves would have had their own means of communication, although the French and the British tried as much as possible to separate them. So they would move one family. If they took like four from one family, they would probably send one to Jamaica, one to the US. They would keep two in Dominica and so on. So they tried their best to separate them out. But at the end of the day, they would have developed these means of speaking and communicating amongst themselves, so that they could not be heard or they could not be listened upon by the owners. But it's a very interesting dynamic, it's a very interesting discussion as well, even in terms of how the whole language developed and what they did, to protect themselves. And also, you'll notice that the African language is completely gone.
Right.
After a few years, that the language of Africa, whatever, whether it is from that part of Africa, which is Nigeria, Guinea, in that area, what they call the Gulf of Biafra there, that includes Senegal, Gambia, Niger, that particular area there where a lot of our slaves came from, our ancestors came from, they would have been speaking a common language. And then that language would have obviously have died out over the years, and then they would have to substitute the Creole and in other cases the English for it.
For okay. All right. So I think we've gotten a very good discussion around the motivation, the inspiration, the content of the book, what to do if I don't know if there's anything additional that
Yeah,
you may have
I
wanted
wanted to
to
read. I
read.
wanted to read a passage. Just a little
Sure.
bit, a little
So this
passage.
is the time to do that. Uh-huh.
I think that captures this, and it's in page 217. And we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about the heat of the debate in Parliament to abolish the slave trade, and that was in the year 1817. Slavery was eventually abolished in 1843. But see how Dominica comes into play. So they're before Parliament. All right. On this occasion, before Parliament in 1817, Romilly, who was one of the individual I quoted earlier, pointed to the quote several cases that had come before a grand jury in Dominica, and some of them showed that the greatest cruelty had been exercised against the slaves. The cruel punishment was not, however, limited to the slaves on the plantations, but was particularly severe to those Maroons who continued to take refuge in the forests of Dominica. One such case of cruel punishment meted out by the whites relates to John McCory, a slave master who had, with cords, whips, sticks, and rods, scourged and flogged his slave who was guilty of being absent from the plantation. Another was that of Genton, a female slave who had been assaulted by her master, and afterward he confined her in an iron chain by fastening the chain to her neck, arms, and legs with padlocks. She was further maimed, defaced, mutilated, and cruelly tortured, and her arms fractured. Both cases were brought before a grand jury presided over by W. Granville, who by now was the Attorney General of Dominica, after serving as the judge advocate during the court martials of the Maroons. Romilly maintained that, quote, neither the slave nor his family nor friends could obtain any redress against the cruelties of his master. The slave was cruelly treated, and the public sympathized with the master. The public, as in the British public or the French public, not the slaves. But that gives you another account. These were some of the discussions that were going on in the British Parliament. And it had to do with the treatment of the slaves, and particularly the vicious treatment that the Negmawa was receiving at the hands of the masters. Incredible. And but it's there in black and white, and certainly it's a fascinating read, and is something I believe that we really should catch on to.
Yeah, I agree that this book should become standard reading. I think there's enough material in there that could result in a few theatrical productions. There's songs in there's sermons in there, because it really captures a human condition in a period of time where uh, so much inhumanity was allowed in the pursuit of economic gain.
Mhm.
And so, Dr. Fontaine, I want to congratulate you on this book. Folks, I am sure that you enjoyed learning about this work as much as I did reading it and talking to Dr. Fontaine about it. Go out and get your copy. He said it's available um, practically everywhere. And if it's at 30 EC dollars, which is just a little bit, I mean, 30 EC dollars, maybe less than 12, around $12 US, that's a steal with the amount of effort and diligence that went into this book, and all the sources are there that that if people are so inclined, they can pick up any thread from this book and run with it and go deeper, and which is what I would encourage you to do. So get your copy. It's not too early to think of giving it as a Christmas gift. Certainly, as Dominica approaches 50 years of independence from Britain, this would be a wonderful gift to give throughout the year 2028. We don't have to wait that long, but if you read it, I'm sure you'll agree with me that every Dominican should have their copy of the Maroons of Dominica, because that tells the story of our people, not just as enslaved people, but as heroes. And let us think about how can we commemorate those people? How can we keep them in our minds, in our consciousness, and have their suffering, their resistance, their sacrifice become part of our decision making as we go forward, as Caribbean people, as Dominicans. Dr. Fontaine, we're bringing this to a close. It's right around 90 minutes. I think it's a good place to close it off. I'm going to give you the opportunity to make some closing remarks, and then we'll wrap.
I am extremely delighted to be able to have been able to do this work. Although, as I claim, I'm not a historian, has not claimed to be one, but just a desire to put out there the tremendous story, especially when I learned of Bala and the fact that he was from the Grand Fort area, and somehow I felt a kinship. I felt, almost attached to this idea, to this revolutionary, and the way, and when they were raiding the Rosalie estate, where, by the way, of the five white overseers who were on the Rosalie estate. They ended up killing five of them. Sorry, of the five, they ended up killing three of them, including the estate owner. But they killed the son of the best friend at the time and the co-leader of Bala's group, which was Kongori. They killed his son, and the story is told when he held his son, and then when he had a chance to execute during the riot, the owner, he said, "This one is for my son," and that those words are there. And then he had this famous word, let it burn. And they set fire, they ransacked the estate totally and completely, and they were able to escape. But interestingly enough, the story of the ransacking of the Rosalie estate and what actually transpired was a slave that decided not to go with the party, but went to town to report on what had happened. And so whilst we have a lot of heroes in the book, you also have a lot of those house slaves that were quite willing to rat on their fellow slaves, and the behavior we seem to have with us up to now. While some people are doing something, you have others who are not so minded, and who, it seems that you can trace the lineage, I guess, of those two different groups. But it's very, it's a
That's
very,
an interesting comment, Dr. Fontaine.
it is a good story. It is a good historical thing, which to me again confirms the place of Dominica in the scheme of things. I always believe that this country is a very special place, and reading that story, understanding our location, understanding how the whole country emerged and evolved over that period, tells me that this country is great, that we still have before us the great Kalinago people,
Yes.
tells me that this country is special, and we need to understand that we are not an ordinary country. And I believe when you read the history of Dominica, you will understand that. You'll understand why it was that the Kalinagos survived only on Dominica, why it is that you had slaves who never spent one day on the estate and were able to live all their lives as free individuals, raise their kids. And one final note that we have, and it's something I've been trying really hard to do further research on. The son of Bala was actually captured by the governor,
Hmm.
Governor John Ord, and he took him back to London with him. He took him back to London, and but this story goes cold after that. We have a record of him taking him back because I guess he was so impressed with the bravery and so on of his father that he wanted a piece of his son. So he adopted him. He actually took him back with him
Wow.
to London, but we don't know what happened to him
Happened there.
once he got there. We don't know what happened to him, and that's a very interesting story. I would like to get, if I could get some information as to what became of him. You know, whether he was able to live long enough to have kids in England and so on, and his
Whether his
offspring or
Bala's
descendants,
bloodline
their
continued, right?
bloodline continues. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Very interesting.
But
But
we're
yeah, so,
we're pretty sure that the Negbawan blood continued
oh
beyond
yes,
that time,
it
Yeah.
flows. Well, it flows freely in all of us now.
Right. Right.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much
Yes,
for sitting down and having this conversation with me. I am pretty honored, and I'm really looking forward to just having that conversation continue, to have it blossom about our heroes, our warriors. We have a cenotaph which is erected in Roseau for the veterans of the world wars, and we have Poppy Day where we go and pay homage to them. I think it's time that in Dominica we do have something similar we have something similar for heroes of the resistance fight for freedom, the fight for the resistance to slavery. We have to think about how we can go about having that be a significant occurrence in our country. The same way they have Poppy Day, that they recognize all of this
You're
foreign
absolutely
wars.
correct. You're
Yeah,
Tony. You're absolutely correct. We can do better than just this emancipation center, because we have the names of those individuals who were killed. They're all recorded. We have the names,
yeah,
and we have the in most cases we have the estates that
mm-hmm.
they came from. Okay. The only disadvantage is that we will not know who were the family, because at that time they only had one name.
Right,
Is after the abolition of slavery we began having two names,
right,
and a lot of the surnames were taken again, the surnames of the masters, or the
right,
former. But at that time, it was just one name. It was Rachel or Thomas or Monique, and
mm-hmm. Right,
yeah. But then if you know what the estates that they came from, and we also have the census. We have the slave censuses. We have those information again, the one names, but you know those names of the individuals and what estate that they were actually from. You can't really trace the lineage, but you can erect something that would honor all of these
I would
heroes.
honor these people
Yeah,
certainly, because we
absolutely.
owe what we have to them,
To them, without a
and as we
doubt.
said,
And
until
even the
we
early abolition of slavery, I think, had a lot to do with what transpired in our own country.
in Dominica. So folks, as I said, it was a pleasure doing this conversation with Dr. Fontaine. Uh, Thompson, wish you continued success, continued energy in all your endeavors, all of them. We named a few of them: economist, consultant, aspiring political leader,
Politician.
uh, writer, historian that you seem to you seem not 200% claim. But all of those things, because it seems that out of your efforts usually comes fruits that you get to share with us and we all enjoy. So thank you for what you've done so far and what you continue to do, and we can only wish you continued good health and energy and support and resources to help you to go forward. So all the best.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, though.
Okay. So the listeners and viewers and participants of the Right to Kubuli uh, Literary Festival, there was a conversation with a very accomplished gentleman, Dr. Uh, Thomson Fontaine, and he wrote the book The Maroons of Dominica, 1764 to 1880, and he tells the story, and it's brilliant writing. Even if it is dense with dates and information and stuff, it's done in such a way where I don't think anyone can accuse the writing of being boring or tedious or any other of those discussions. I think it's engaging and actually enrapturing that when you pick it up, you just want to go forward, and it makes you cry, and as I said, it makes you celebrate, it makes you just feel as though you wanted to reach back there and grab somebody and shake them, or grab somebody and shake their hand or hug them. All of those emotions you go through in reading this book. So I encourage you to get your copy, and I want you to continue to enjoy the Right to Kubuli Literary Festival, and to congratulate and to thank everybody who uh, played a part in making this possible. Because when we went to grammar school, we did English literature and studied Shakespeare and Thomas Hardy and all of these other British writers. What about Dominican literature or West Indian literature or Caribbean literature, where because we have such a rich body of work, let us put that on the same or even a higher shelf than English literature. Let us look at Dominican literature. Let's look at Dominican writing. This is an example of nonfiction work. We have fiction as well. We have poetry. We have all different sorts of writing, and it's just packed with works from various authors. And so, on behalf of the organizers, I thank you for participating, and we look forward to your feedback and continued, moving forward, strength to strength with the Write-Tukubuli uh, Literary Festival. Good evening.